Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Music for Self-Isolation chat with me, Frank Horvat, composer, pianist, and music educator. It's a great pleasure to welcome today William McLeish, who is a Canadian cellist and music educator based in the Netherlands. William is a member of a variety of ensembles in the Netherlands, and that includes the Babylon Quartet. That's how we became connected with his work with this wonderful, amazing string quartet. And so today we're going to be talking about the pandemic and all the stuff that's happened these last bunch of months. William, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So we're well into many months now as we record this. We've been many months into a world that's been in lockdown, in self-isolation. Obviously, a lot of tragedy with a lot of deaths, a lot of people getting very sick, and specifically in our world of music, a lot of musicians being impacted. Let's go back to maybe March, the month of March, when the Western world, as we know it, especially Europe and North America, right after, began this whole thing of closing down, shutting down, locking down as the seriousness of this situation grew. What do you remember about that time?
Well, I guess, so for a little background, I had been sort of following the story very closely, actually, as it had evolved in China and then in Italy. I mean, I'm sure that there's lots of people that were interested, but I was certainly one of them. And so when things started shutting down, for me, actually, it seemed like kind of the logical conclusion of what I had seen all over the world. And I mean, I think that for a lot of people, that maybe for whom this issue sort of flew under the radar, it would have come as a shock that, suddenly countries had to people had to stand still and stay at home and avoid contact with each other. But for me, I actually had a feeling of relief because I thought, okay, finally people are taking this seriously. There was, where my partner and I live in The Hague, we live across the street from two very, very busy bars. And so the bars were closed on a Sunday night, and that would have been Sunday, March, I'm going to say 15th, I think. And March 14th, which was a Saturday night, everybody was out there partying. It was just packed outside. And my partner and I looked outside and we were like, this is insane. I mean, this is ridiculous. And so when they shut down the bars, I remember breathing a sigh of relief because I thought, well, at least something is being done. That's not to, I don't mean to take away from, the very real economic and sociological impacts of the shutdowns. Those are real. But at the very start, I remember feeling some sense of relief that finally, well, I remember a few days earlier, maybe 4 or 5 days earlier, the WHO had formally announced that they had formally declared a global pandemic. And one of the reasons they cited was frightening levels of inaction in Europe. And 5 days later, I remember thinking, there's still frightening levels of inaction. And then finally, the tide started to turn, and most, if not all, countries in Europe started to take aggressive action. So, yeah.
So obviously, you feel very passionately that a lockdown and self-isolation is a very important way, and it was a very important way at those early moments to control the pandemic or control the spread of the virus. How do you balance that feeling with the fact that you are a professional musician and you're obviously, those feelings you have obviously mean that you're not working? How do you balance that out personally, emotionally for yourself?
Well, I have to say that I was on the fortunate end of the spectrum. And the reason is that I had students, and a lot of the freelancers that I know either didn't have any students, or their students didn't want to make the transition into virtual lessons, or they didn't have enough students. And I was very lucky that I had some students. So financially, the transition, meaning like obviously, if you go from earning money doing A and B, and suddenly B is no longer happening, you have less money. But I was fortunate enough that there was some financial relief from the government, some, not a tremendous amount, but some financial relief from the government, and I was able to continue working and making some money during the the height in April. So I guess on a personal level, what I really miss actually is rehearsing. I really missed rehearsing. Because not only is rehearsing, an exchange of musical ideas, it's also like it's a social ritual. It's especially chamber music. It's the social element of chamber music is really, especially for musicians for whom a lot of their time is spent in a practice room. Musicians are already sort of self-isolating by default. So I miss the social element of rehearsing. That being said, and I think that this perspective might be unpopular amongst my colleagues, but I actually think that for a short time for musicians to go from, especially freelance musicians, for whom life is kind of chaotic, it involves traveling, 10 hours a week, maybe more, to a different city each time, rehearsing in a different city, learning a lot of music in a short amount of time, not really always being able to really focus on one thing, not always learning the music that you really want to learn, because sometimes you just have to learn the thing that you're being asked to learn. And I think that it's healthy actually for musicians to take a step back and really evaluate, what part of this lifestyle is absolutely critical and fundamental to the process of, bringing people music, and how can we rethink the musical profession going forward? So this is a long answer, but I guess the short answer is I think it's healthy actually for musicians to take some time off of performing, especially. I mean, if you look at the rate of burnout in musicians, if you think of like top soloists who, like Janine Janssen, who performs God knows how many concerts per year, but once every 5 years she's completely burnt out and she can't perform for like 6 months, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
So for me, again, I'm sure that this is not the case for lots of musicians, but for me, it was healthy to be able to just sort of reconnect with the instrument, to practice whatever I wanted to practice a lot more piano, which I haven't practiced piano in 12, 13 years.
You talked about how perhaps musicians have to reevaluate how we do what we do because of the impact of the thing, and how society is going to have changed because of this, and then therefore impact what we do. How about for you personally? How has the pandemic changed your plans for the future? And if so, like, what were you what did you always see was sort of your path in your professional or even personal life? And now how has that changed because of the pandemic?
So I guess the answer to how has this pandemic changed my plans for the future, the short answer is, well, I no longer have any plans for the future because it's impossible to plan for the future. That's sort of the short answer. I do have to say that in terms of evaluating my role as a musician in society, whereas before, social issues were something that I was interested in, but they were generally sort of separate from my day-to-day activities, and might talk with people occasionally about social issues, but it wasn't really something that I felt was, I never really had the sense that, oh, I need to lend my voice to a social issue. And so I guess that the pandemic has forced me to consider what my role in society is, and forced me to think hard about my role, not only as a professional and an entrepreneur, but also as a citizen, and to think about how I can balance my desire to be a prominent and thriving musician with my desire to help, and to participate in society in a meaningful way. And how do these two things, citizen and musician, how do these things feed into each other?
Now, one of the ways that the pandemic has inspired you to be more vocal on various social issues, but the one that stands out to me a lot that I've been aware of from following your posts on social media, so forth, is your take on how the pandemic has specifically affected seniors, and the role of long-term care facilities and so forth. Would you like to talk a little bit about that? Like maybe summarize your view on this?
I'm not like a long-term care expert, so I should just preface by saying that. But I do think that maybe the pandemic is forcing us to reevaluate the model itself of long-term care. I think for decades we've sort of accepted it as a given that when people get old enough, they just move into a home, but we know. I remember I was reading this article, this Dutch article that talked about pre-pandemic, people their life expectancy once they reach a long-term care home is 3 years. It's only 3 years. So now, obviously, they're older, so they're more likely to die. But I think that reevaluating the model itself, is this really a humane way to treat the oldest and wisest members of our society? I think that for me, what was the most heartbreaking in the Netherlands, outbreaks in long-term care homes were and still are almost completely unreported. And the journalists were sort of focusing on the hospitals and intensive care. And also in the Netherlands, they were really focusing on the sociological impacts of the so-called lockdowns, which again, that's a valid thing to be concerned about. But one thing that was consistently under or unreported was outbreaks in long-term care homes. And we know this because if you look at the death count in the Netherlands, the official death count for COVID-19 in the Netherlands, it's only about half of the excess death, what's known as excess death in the Netherlands. So if you plot the number of deaths per week in the months of March, April, and May in the Netherlands against a historical average, then the true death toll is probably closer to 10,000 people, whereas the official death toll is about 6,000. So we know that almost half of people who died of COVID-19, or we can estimate that almost half of people who died of COVID-19 were never tested, and probably if they never got tested, it means they probably never made it to a hospital. We know that in long-term care facilities in the Netherlands, older people that were dying of COVID were maybe administered morphine, but not necessarily oxygen. And I don't mean a ventilator. I mean like an oxygen tank. And that even if you're dying, an oxygen tank can alleviate the pain of dying of COVID-19. And so the reason that those deaths were not counted is because those people were never tested, and so their deaths were never added to the official death toll. For me, it's not just about the suffering, it's about the degree to which that suffering was invisible. That, for me, makes me very, very angry, actually. Yeah, so.
So what, do you think it's just a standard discrimination against the elderly that caused a lack of inaction and a lack of, looking ahead and saying we have to be prepared for this?
Honestly, if I'm being perfectly frank, I think that the reason that Europe as a whole failed to prepare adequately in the nearly 2 months that they had to prepare is that they assumed that Asia was different. That oh well, we're a wealthier, more advanced society. Nothing like that could ever happen to us. So I think actually it's probably the myth of European exceptionalism is probably what drove a lot of the inaction, and probably more widely speaking, the myth of Western exceptionalism was a major driver. And it wasn't until we saw serious outbreaks in Italy that European nations started to consider, oh wow, this could actually happen here. Thankfully, then they did act, although not always as comprehensively as they might.
Let's look at the sunny side maybe a bit.
Yeah.
What good things do you think have come out of the pandemic? That indirectly the world has gotten ironically better because of the pandemic, or even like what lessons we as a world have learned because of the pandemic, any of that?
It's hard to be optimistic about the near future because that is so precarious, I think. But I do think, my hope is that a crisis like this, which comes on so quickly and so suddenly, and exposes the vulnerabilities of our economies and our social vulnerabilities, I'm hoping that it will force us to re-examine the way that we evaluate other crises, the most obvious ones being climate change. I'm hoping. It's really hard to say. I guess my answer would be, there's a lot of things that it's possible to be optimistic about. There's a lot of good that can come out of this. And there's lots of good that has come out of this if we think about, the sacrifices that have been made by healthcare workers and the sacrifices that have been made by everyday individuals, people staying home. It's an act of compassion, and lots of people did that. Not everybody, but lots of people did. And it's because they cared about each other. And, that's deeply moving. And so, there's lots to be optimistic about. I'm apprehensive about the future, but in the long term, my hope is that this crisis will force us to reevaluate the way that we consider risk, and the way that we approach risk, and the way that we deal with existential threats that aren't immediate human violence. We're very good at dealing with, we're very good at preparing for acts of human violence. The resources that go into protecting against something like terrorism are almost unthinkable. I mean, so much money and so much civil liberty actually is expended in order to fight terrorism. And terrorism, at least in most Western nations, kills the tiniest fraction of the number of people that can be killed by a global pandemic or by climate change. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about priorities, isn't it? And you look at our friends to the, in the United States there, and it's quite evident that with a lack of focus and direction, you can see what kind of a unfortunate disaster it is right now in that country with the amount of deaths and so forth and outbreaks. So Now, let's get back to our profession of music. What do you think it's going to be like what do you think it's going to be like to be a working musician? And
Yeah.
like, we know what it's like now because we know everything is precarious. We don't know what the future is going to be like, but when the dust settles, do you think it's going to go back to business as usual? Let's envision a future where there's no pandemic. Everybody can be as close as they want, and just basically what life was like pre-pandemic. Do you think we're ever going to return to that lifestyle? People going to lots of concerts. We sit wherever we want. We go to any club or concert hall we want. What's the future of our world of music going to look like?
So my suspicion is that there is no return to 2019. That that life will never happen again. It'll be different, and it'll probably be different in a lot of good ways. I do think, I said earlier, I think it's good for musicians to take a step back once in a while, because musicians work really hard, and they take every opportunity they can get because there aren't very many. And they practice a lot. They're willing to expose themselves to, undersleeping or too much traveling or not enough rest, not enough vacation. They're willing to expose themselves to all those things to pursue a career and to thrive as musicians. So I think it's good, provided that musicians are given financial support. I think it's good for musicians to step back in the short term and reconnect with their instrument, or just not play their instrument for a little while. That can also be really healthy. Most musicians have been playing their instrument every day since they were a child. So it might be good just to not play it for a month or 2 months. However, in the long term, what I'm concerned about is not so much the effect. If we're talking like 5 years down the line, my concern is not necessarily the effect of the direct effect of the pandemic on musicians' careers. It is the effect of the financial outcome of the pandemic on musicians' careers. A lot of countries, including the Netherlands, are cutting the 5-year source of funds for major cultural institutions. And the truth is that once you do that, they're not coming back. I mean, you can't cut. If you have a cultural institution and you cut funding and they disappear, they can't magically reappear when the economy starts thriving again. That doesn't happen. And so I think that is a very real danger. It's not the immediate danger. The immediate threat is the pandemic. But I think in the long term, the threat to musicians' lives years down the line will be similar to the threat of the previous recession, where arts were the first to go in lots and lots of countries. So I think that is the major threat that musicians face in the long term.
What's going to replace that then? How are musicians going to adapt to the new reality of the lack of a lot less funding from it's government institutions?
It's funny because musicians did adapt in the last recession. If there was, prior to the last recession, a lot of the work that musicians had was heavily institutionalized. So, go to a conservatory, take an audition, get an orchestra job, you're good to go. Following the recession, musicians were supposed to reevaluate and reconsider themselves as not only musicians, but as entrepreneurs and as multidisciplinary. And that's good and bad. I think, musicians, a lot of classical musicians bemoan that because it means that they have to spend a lot of their time doing things that they're not really trained for. And that's a valid concern, but it's also good, I think, for musicians, especially classical musicians, to become more interdisciplinary, because it's very easy to exist in this bubble as a classical musician. And going forward, I imagine that musicians will find a way to adapt, because as they did. And there will probably be some trailblazers, people that have really novel ideas about the way to go forward in So far, I have seen a limited number of really convincing ways to manage as a musician during this crisis. But it will happen. There will be trailblazers. That being said, I don't think it should be taken for granted that musicians will adapt. That shouldn't be taken for granted. It shouldn't be taken for granted that the cultural sector will bounce back. You can't expect that to happen. The only reason that that will happen, if it does, is through tremendous effort and tremendous initiative. So we can't just assume that's going to happen in and of itself.
Finally, one last thing. The word hope is a very vague and sometimes a fluffy word, but we obviously, as a world, have been living through very, very, like I said earlier, very tragic and dramatic times where every aspect of life for pretty well the entire planet has been changed in some form or another these past 4 months. As we sort of walk through this path and we try to look towards the future, do you have hope? And if so, what specifically do you have hope for?
I guess to be perfectly honest, I feel very apprehensive about the near future. But as I said before, I think that I have hope for the long term. If we're looking at like the long game here, I'm playing the long game. I think that in the short term, it's very hard to have hope right now. We should keep hope. We should stay hopeful. This is temporary. It is temporary. Life will not always be like this. And so I think that everybody should keep that in mind. It's not always going to be like this. Things will change. Hope can connote inaction. And we should have hope if we invest in the future. We can't just be hopeful that things will get better on their own. We need to participate in the future that we want to see. I just want to say, actually, with regard to that, it'd be nice to be able to use this platform to address, young people in the during the pandemic. I think that what's been so moving about young people in the past months and the past years, particularly if we're talking about millennials and Gen Z, what's been moving is the way that they've taken on issues of racism and climate change as their issues. These are problems that their generation is going to really address. And this is, that's really special. And one of the great strengths, I think actually even of the generation just before me is the way that they've, taken on climate change as this is their problem to solve. What hasn't happened yet, and what I'd still like to see is for people of our generation to consider the pandemic in the same way as our problem, as something that we need to all be engaged in, as something that we all need to participate in. It's not going to go away unless we all participate.
Well, on that note, William, thank you so much for this. It's been a very enlightening conversation, and look forward to keeping in touch and also exploring a lot of more of these issues as we move forward. So thank you very much for doing this chat today.
Thank you very much.